Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the series where I'm recreating Murray's costume manner from Secret of the Mimic in Minecraft. In the last video we took a look at the warehouse, the loading bay, and the admin wing, but today we're going to be moving on to all three of the showrooms. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to subscribe to the channel with all notifications turned on, so that way you don't miss out on the rest of the series, and can also help the channel to reach 200,000 subscribers before the end of the year. But without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started with a time lapse. I know I just said that I'm going to be building the three showrooms in this video, but in reality, I'm actually going to be knocking out the entirety of the second floor of the MCM, so that way, basically the entirety of the factory portion of the project is all completed. I've split this series up in ways so that way there's enough progress for me to show off in every episode, but I also wanted to make sure that I was actually able to do everything in a timely manner. But the second floor, it's so spread out, but still it has not that many large rooms, where it was honestly just easier for me to do the entire thing in one episode, so that's exactly what I'm going to be doing. On top of the three showrooms, the Storytime Showroom, the BigTop Showroom, and the Birthday Showroom, I'm also going to be building the other areas you see, like the manager's office and in that small crawl space behind it. And honestly, this was probably the most challenging part of the build by far so far, as though I'd already outlined everything ahead of time, so I already know where everything's going before I even started on the build, what really made this a challenge was the weird shapes of each room. You can see here in this little hallway here that connects the Showtime hub to the Birthday Showroom, there's a lot of rooms that aren't just a symmetrical shape anymore. They have these weird diagonals that sometimes make a perfect curve like a circle and are sometimes just blocks placed in random spaces, so that way it looks weird. It looks really good once it's all done, and I really like how this build turned out, but I'd be lying if I said that this floor didn't have the most weird room shapes that I've had to build before. It's a big challenge, but it does make it fun, and especially once the build is done, it makes exploration even more interesting because, again, not every room is the same, so you're going to have a new, unique experience every time you go around a place. But in the rooms where there are those symmetrical rooms, again, like in this small hallway here, it's very easy. There's lots of those same props we see in other places, like shelves. There's some withering around the place. I also like to add in some different texturing to the floor, so that way it's not just one solid block. I always like to add little bits of details to solid surfaces. That way it's not just bland and boring to look at. It could be very easy for me to just make a wall out of a single block. And while I do that in some of these smaller rooms, there's some detail in between the walls that breaks up all the detail and makes it still nice to look at. For floors, however, I really like breaking it up as it just adds a small amount of detail where it still makes the build look more interesting and add a lot more character to the build itself. But even without all of that detailing, the amount of decorations on the second floor just takes up so much space. On the first floor there was still a lot of it, but it was more spread out across certain areas, but almost the entirety of the second floor has lots of cramped and compact rooms because there are so many shelving units, boxes, and other just decorations that you'd see in carnivals scattered all across the room. On top of that, most of these staff hallways and areas also are very small to begin with, so it just makes everything feel even more claustrophobic while still having lots of cool details to look at. You know, just because this is the back hallway that the public is never going to see, there's still lots of cool stuff to go over. So that's something I was really excited about getting into the second floor with all of the showrooms, and I think that we're going to see even more of that throughout this video. It may have been difficult to put together, however, I absolutely love how this build is turning out so far, especially this main hub right here that leads to the three showrooms. It reminds me of a more toned down pizzaplex, where instead of having neon lights along the walls, we instead have these colorful stripes along them, but we still have lots of different decorations around the place, where it still makes you look at every single individual detail, where everywhere you look there's something new to see. Now we'll move on to these two showrooms in a little bit, but for right now I want to take a look at what I have built so far, with that being the Birthday Showroom. So if we go through all this, you can first see this small hallway that I was talking about during the time lapse, where you can see the really weird shape of it. The hallways are no longer just straight rectangles that lead from point A to point B, they now have these really unique shapes, which are both really fun to look at as they add lots of fun details around the place, but they are very annoying to outline, and you can see just how many of them there are, and It's very fun, it is, but honestly, I'd be lying if I said that making these types of rooms is so much easier. But then again, I don't do these things because they're easy, I do it because of the challenge and it's just fun to see everything come together. But this brings us to probably one of my favorite builds I've made so far, which is the birthday showroom itself, where of course, the main attraction is Jackie's box in the center of the room. But it's not just the walls and the flooring that make this room one of my favorites, it's of course all of the actual decorations inside of it. Like this toy train right here, the birthday showroom has lots of upscaled toys, and this right here is an upscaled train model. There's like this castle wall here where you can actually walk inside of it, and then you would find the present of the Full Fest snow globe. And then over here is my favorite in the room, which is the giant mascot of the elephant. The next room over then brings us back to those more industrial staff areas where we still have lots of objects around the room. However, you can tell how the color scheme has completely changed from bright colors to now more tan and brown all along the place. There's still lots of interesting things to look at, however, like along this wall here, where we have a bunch of different banners for each of the different mascots and restaurants around the attraction. Then of course at the end of the hallway is the manager's office itself, where not only are we able to look out of this window down to the main warehouse, but there's also the generator that we would turn on, which would then start the chase sequence for Jackie to activate, break through the wall, and that's when the chase sequence would actually start. I do eventually want to actually make those chase sequences. However, for the time being, I'm just going to leave it at this. You can see I've already outlined a little bit of it, but the reason why I'm not going to do the entirety of the chase sequence right now is because they're not actually connected to the MCM. Again though, that will be a topic we take a look at another time, but I will be adding in those chase sequences at some point in the future. The last part is then directly across from this hallway, which is honestly in my opinion one of the most underrated places in MCM, not because of what goes on here, but really because of the general layout of it all. Of course, there's this small office space again right here where we then upgrade the data diver to repairs. However, I really want to go over the layout, as this door right here is actually locked off from us and we're not able to open it, and that's because there's a bunch of trash that's blocking it, stopping us from being able to go from this hallway to a completely different room. Instead, what we have to do is go behind Jackie's box once it's left, then go through this vent system to this different room here, which is then going to cycle all the way back around to where we just were. And in my opinion, this honestly makes it so much more interesting to go over, as instead of just using the expected entryways to go from point A to point B, you have to be a bit more creative and use some of those hidden spaces so that way you're able to explore the entirety of the build. These aren't even just for looks either, as lots of them do actually have a purpose, like this room right here, which would then let us fix the elevator, so that way we're able to go from the top floor down to the bottom again. And before anyone says anything in the comments, I did notice this, let's just go ahead and fix this quickly. Up next, I want to move on to the Storytime Showroom, where already you can see more of those diagonal and curved outlines that I was talking about earlier, which I can only imagine is going to be a challenge to put in all of those details needed. But in the main showroom itself, we once again have a lot of interesting things going on, as not only is there tons of scaffolding that's collapsed, we also have this giant crater in the room, which is then going to lead down to this section of the theater, which will then eventually lead down to the basement where the moon crashed through all 3 stories. So even if this general area is smaller than what we've just gone over, I can still see this taking just as long, if not even more, because of the amount of detail that goes on in this build. So without any further ado, let's just go ahead and get started. Once again, this part of the build ended up being quite challenging, but not because of anything that I've gone over so far. There are still some of those weirdly shaped hallways that lead up to the main showroom, but the showroom itself is really just one big rectangle, so you'd think it'd be easy to just place in everything needed and there'd be no complications whatsoever. But as you can see here, what I'm already starting to do is do something completely different with the walls of the hallway, which is something no other area in MCM has, which is have the walls be completely made up of a set art piece. The Storytime Showroom's walls are all completely set in a fantasy landscape, where instead of just having wall stripes along them or different posters, the walls themselves are a giant art piece of a fantasy landscape where one side has a forest, one side has a mountain range, there's even a dragon at some point, and then also a castle on the other side of the room. So instead of just placing down a single block and then going over it again a second time with some texturing details, there's no posters to fill in that space either. It really is just one giant pixel art for each wall, which then come together to represent that giant landscape. It is really fun, and it is completely different to anything else in the MCM, but it definitely took a lot more time than any other wall, where I now have to worry about what the wall is going to look like on top of all the other details that go along inside the room. So it's another fun example of how every area has its own challenges, where it's not just put a certain amount of objects in this small crammed corner and then make that work. There are actual challenges when it comes to the larger size of things as well, like these giant walls that we've just gone over. Now the thing is with this is that we're not actually able to really take in the scenery properly, as the top half of the room is completely covered in scaffolding. Instead of having the ceiling be a night sky, for example, it's just a black void with tons of collapsed scaffolding because they weren't able to carry the weight of the moon that crashed through the floor. This is just a really small nitpick, as the rest of the room itself is really fun, and it also adds more character to this build again, as not only does it have a different theme to every other room, but it also has an interesting gimmick that once again makes this room so much more different than anything else. But despite all of those differences and challenges, having a more detailed build is of course going to make for a more interesting one to explore, despite the fact that it may take some time for me to figure out how I want to actually put this build together. My favorite part, and of course the main focus of the build, has to be each of the walls, where instead of just using solid blocks for all of the decorations, you can see I used different building techniques like signs for the scales on the dragon, or some buttons for the eyelid or the stars in the sky. This was actually something I set out to get better at in one of my previous projects where I had little experience with pixel art, but this really takes it to the next extreme, where now it's not just pixel art, but is instead the entire wall decoration. So you can see how I've had to do different things to make it look interesting, where instead of having the forest be one giant slab of green, there's actually different shades and shapes, so that way you can make out the different decorations. Though I suppose none of that compares to the actual mess that's going on in this build, with all of the scaffolding and the giant hole in the floor, which then connects down to the theater beneath it. So beforehand I just had a sheet of black concrete so that way we couldn't see out into the void, but now we can actually connect these two rooms together, despite the fact that the holes themselves aren't actually aligned up. Now this isn't actually a fault on my end, this is actually just how the game is designed, where this room and the room beneath it are actually on top of each other, but the crater itself is moved in more of a diagonal way instead of it just being a straight hole that goes from top to bottom. I did have to do a little bit of natural terraforming to transition between the two rooms, as there's about 10 blocks of space between the two. They're not directly stacked on top of each other, which meant I did have to add in a little bit of my own things to the build, that way it could go from one build all the way down to the other. And speaking of other rooms, let's go ahead and move on to the BigTop Showroom, which is the final one needed to complete this part of the build. And honestly, this area has been one of the most highly anticipated areas in all of MCM, and it's honestly easy to see why, as not only does it have one of the most iconic and memorable characters in the game, but it also has one of the coolest locations. You know, this is literally one big carnival tent, and there's also tons of little mini games inside of it that make this area just that much more interesting. On top of all that, there's also a really long backstage hallway that circles around the entirety of the showroom, and eventually lead back to this small basement over here, which is then going to lead back to the hallway that leads back to the hub. So once again, this is another instance of there being multiple ways to get in and out of certain areas without needing to take the main entrance every single time. Finally is of course the section that eventually leads up to the roof, which is also going to be added. However, I'm not going to be working on the roof just yet. That'll be saved for later on when I do the entirety of the exterior all at once. But with all of this being said, I'm honestly really excited to just get started working on this room, so let's not waste any more time and start placing down some blocks. Let me just say, building this was a whole lot of fun. Getting the replay for it though was probably the most tedious, biggest pain in the ass thing I've had to do this entire project so far. Both this area has lots of creative ways where I could have used it, but then it also has some really tight and compact areas that made it really difficult for me to actually get the camera to look at everything that I'm building. That's something I honestly do struggle a lot sometimes, is getting the camera to actually focus on where I'm at. That way it doesn't look from one side of the room and then zooms all the way around just to look at one block placed on the other side of the room. So because all of this is one big circle, I was able to do some more simple shots, like go from one side all the way around to the other, then on the top floor go the opposite way around. But then with all of those tight and compact hallways around it all, it was very difficult to make sure I wasn't just clipping into every wall around me, especially since there are so many smaller rooms all around it. It did get a bit difficult at times, but honestly, these time lapses are just really fun to watch anyway, so those probably take longer than the actual build itself, but they are always very rewarding at the end, seeing all of the work condensed together and just watching the build come together. It's really, really fun. I say this all the time, but being able to build it firsthand and then watch the process come together so quickly is honestly just really satisfying. You get the satisfaction of building it, and then you get the satisfaction of watching it on top of it. But complaints aside, the BigTop Showroom was honestly really interesting with its design, because of course it has a carnival look to it, so the majority of blocks are those red and orange blocks, but then some of those smaller decorations use blocks that I don't really use often. Like there was cases of glazed terracotta, which is a block I never used before. Don't remember the last time I've used that. There's more instances of sponges for the bottom of the pillars where there's some yellow showing up, where I didn't just want to use yellow terracotta because they had a little bit more grind to them, so I decided, use sponge. It has a little bit of, not withering, that's not really the word to say, but it's got more texturing to it that makes it more interesting. So again, using different blocks in different ways, so that way it makes the build stand out more, and it doesn't make it look more professional just because there's different types of blocks, but it does make each part stand out more and makes each part of the build more memorable than if I were to just use the same blocks over and over again. I've talked before about having consistency with the builds and how it's okay to sometimes break away from that consistency, and as long as the build looks good at the end of the day, it really shouldn't matter how things come together. That said, because I am recording with the replay mod to get all of this, that does actually need to be somewhat of an order, so that way I'm able to, again, move the camera around. You can see just in this small area how many times I've had to go from the top floor all the way down to the bottom, and then go from one side of the build all the way to the other once I was done, because it's not very easy to move the camera around. I could have just cut the recording and then made a completely separate one, but I figured I might as well just do it all in one go. There's no point in stopping for a few minutes just so that way I can reset the replay. It's just things like that I thought it was worth bringing up, because it's not just the build itself that goes into these videos. There's a whole lot of planning, there's a whole lot of other things that go into it, like these replays. This is literally what you're watching at the end of the day, so it is important for me to make these both as enjoyable as possible while also showing off the entire build as I'm doing it. And that now wraps everything up to do with the BigTop Showroom, where now that the build is all completed, it really just shows how absolutely grand this is. I mean, just this entryway right here, we go from this arcing over ceiling to then going through this archway and then just looking up and seeing the absolute size of this room. This room is absolutely one of my favorite places in MCM, and I think that I did a really good job replicating it in a Minecraft form. The prize wheel itself is also included in this room right now. However, both of the doorways are currently just made out of blocks and don't have any function, but we are still able to use this secondary staircase and make our way all the way up to the balcony, where then we get another perspective of what the attraction looks like from a second view. I'm honestly surprised how I managed to make everything fit within such a small space, but then again, I'm definitely thankful of doing all of the outlining ahead of time, as if I hadn't done any of that before getting started working on this build, I can see myself running into a lot of problems that wouldn't have made this build be existing in the first place. Once again, of course, then there's the entire hallway that goes around the entire attraction, which was honestly so cool finding for the first time during my first playthrough. Once I completed the prize wheel and was making my way up to the second floor, I was able to see both of these doorways here, but I wasn't sure how you were actually able to access them. In fact, I actually had to use the debug camera just so I could figure out how you were actually supposed to go back here, as there must have been a way. They wouldn't have just added this room for no reason, and figuring all of that out on my own was really cool, and once again helped make this one of the most iconic and memorable parts of the game. And obviously I can't forget about the roof access segment, where we enter inside this smaller security office up here, get the upgrade, and then we're able to access the roof itself. And it's just small details like this again that make the build so much fun. Like, instead of just having an open warehouse with a few shelves, there's actually an entire security office that isn't just its own room, but it's also elevated by using these two different staircases, which is a really unique design. Then of course is the actual roof access itself through this doorway here, where we make it up the staircase, unlock this final door, which will then actually take us up onto the rooftop. But I'm really hoping that the areas of the roof do connect up well with the areas inside the MCM. However, something tells me that I might have to change things up a little bit, but that'll be a project that I need to worry about in the future. Right now, I'm just focusing on the main build itself. But even with the build itself being completed, there is still something missing, and that is of course BigTop himself, who is obviously the most important part of the BigTop Showroom. His name is literally in the name of the area. Now you might have noticed that during the time-lapse I did start to make a mini replica of BigTop by using a mix of blocks, and that's because I do actually have a few different designs that I've gone over in a test world, that way I could later implement them into this world. So I think it's finally time to go ahead and take a look at those designs and finally add them into this world. Now throughout this series so far, you might have noticed that I have been using armor stand models for each of the thumbnails, despite the fact that I said I wasn't going to be adding any of them into the actual map itself until the entire build is done. And that is still true, however that doesn't mean that I couldn't go ahead and prepare for what things are going to look like in the future. So right now, here are all of the armor stand models that I've made so far, with each of them being on a thumbnail besides this one, and a few more that I've made which are going to appear in later thumbnails, but those I don't want to show off because obviously it's going to spoil what I'm going to be working on next. So as of right now, you can see I have models for Jackie herself, then one of the blue mycelium men, the swing bee, of course Party Time Chica, and then the person that we're actually going to be focusing on, BigTop himself. Like with all of my other models, each one is made up by using a mix of different armor stands, which are then teleported and rotated in ways that make it look like the actual character itself. However, for some of these mascot suits, I have done things a little bit differently, where instead of just using a normal torso for their piece like what I've done with Jackie and all of my other animatronics, I've used a different technique to make them look more square and rounded instead of being flat and straightforward. So you can see with each of these suits here, their bodies are made up of two rotated helmets which are facing towards each other. That way it looks like their body is one big block instead of having a slimmer form like with some of the other animatronics. With BigTop though, things needed to work a little bit differently, as he isn't just simple enough to have an armor stand model, he also needed a block built part to him to make up the actual ticket booth itself. So this is the second design that I had with BigTop, my first one being completely block built, which I'll go ahead and put on screen now. But once I decided that I want to go in the armor stand route, this was the next design that I came up with. Now the model itself is probably my favorite of the ones I've shown off so far, but the problem with it is that once I pasted it into the build itself, it ended up looking much smaller than I would have liked. Just this alone is already 5.5 blocks tall, however you can see it is nowhere near the scale that BigTop himself is supposed to be. He's supposed to tower over this room and be a more dominant force, and here he's just really small and doesn't look like he could pose much of a threat at all. So after making a few changes and making the model a bit bigger, this is now the final result, and already this is definitely a whole lot better. I mean, it's much bigger first of all, and it actually feels much more imposing than the smaller model we saw earlier on. Now because the model itself is bigger, obviously there's more space for detail, so you can see on top of just expanding the main armor stands, I also added in some additional ones for his 4 hands inside the ticket booth, as well as for a little bit of the mechanism inside the booth itself, where you can see I added in 2 of the gears by using a trapdoor, and then the gearbox in the center by using one in the middle here. And this looks much better. Again, probably one of my favorite models in this map, probably one of my favorite models that I've ever made. With the amount of different parts that make up this model, I honestly think this turned out really well and makes a great addition to the build. Now on top of that, I have also actually connected all of the armor stands to a central armor stand, meaning I'm able to do this and have the armor stand actually rotate around and face towards me, just like how BigTop does in game. There's a lot of creative things that I can do for these armor stand models, but this again is going to be something that I take a look at in the future once the rest of the build itself has been completed. But with that aside, I quickly want to go ahead and show an overhead view of the entire MCM, as like I've mentioned earlier a few times, that now completes the final piece of the actual MCM factory itself, where all that's left now are all of the basements and the exterior, as well as the mansion, which will be included later on in this series. Now, as I've also been showing off at the start of each one of these builds, I have outlined the entirety of the factory beforehand. That way I was actually able to know what goes where, and that way everything could be put in a proper place. And I'm honestly really thankful for doing that, as though it did take much longer to actually get the hard part out of the way with, it was definitely a much better decision in the long run, and it's helped this build come together in a much better way. So because this is the last area that I had outlined, that means from now on I'm once again going to need to outline each individual area again before I actually start working on them. However, you should know me by now, that hasn't stopped me, and it should come to no surprise that I have already started working on the next outlines for what I'm going to be working on next. Overall though, this has once again been an extremely fun and productive episode for recreating the costume manor in a Minecraft form. All of these showrooms have really been a breath of fresh air, as each one is completely different from anything else in the MCM, even with every room having its own unique part that makes it different from everything else. Each one of the showrooms could have easily been very similar in its size and shape, but each one is completely different from each other, which made it a complete fresh take on every time I got started on something new. Not only that, but I also went over some future plans of what I'd like to do with this project once the build itself has been completed, as even though I'm not focused on any of those stuff at the time being, I do still like to know what I have a general plan for, so that way I have a sense of scale as to how far I want to take this project, know my limits, and see how long it's actually going to take before I can call this map completed. I saw someone bring this up, and it honestly didn't really hit me until just now, where this project is nearly halfway completed already, if not past the halfway point, which is really surprising considering I've only really been at this for about 4 weeks now. It's just been over a month since Secret of the Mimic came out, and I'm already loving how much I've able to do so far, and it once again just gets me really hyped up to see how this project is going to turn out in its finished form. So once again, I'd like to remind you to subscribe to the channel with all notifications turned on, so that way you don't miss out on the rest of the series, and can also join along with me to see how this project is going to turn out. But with all of that being said, thank you everyone so much for watching, and I will of course see you in my next video.